Coriolis Effect and Gravity prove the flat Earth. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Earth Not a Globe. Today I'll be showing the Roundheads how their beloved Coriolis effect proves the Earth as stationary, and the well-known, often misunderstood theory of gravity proves the world as a stationary plane. As a whole, the world is indeed demonstrably a stationary plane. Some very basic, repeatable experiments conclusively prove that the world isn't a spinning globe and never possibly could have been a spinning sphere of any sort. The accepted version of reality reflected in films like Star Wars and Apollo 13 is exactly a theoretical fantasy which was hotly debated by all scientific minds for the last 500 years at least. The theoretical heliocentric model indeed dates back to ancient Greece. However, the nonsensical theoretical model wasn't widely accepted until the last 500 years or so, and continued to be hotly contested right up into the late 1800s and even the early 1900s. It wasn't until the propaganda arm of the United States government started cranking out sci-fi propaganda involving infinite space and aliens during the early 1900s, and the scientific community began priming the minds of suggestible masses for space travel using rocket ships and so-called technology of their time. People have commented on my other videos in response to my assertion that Newton believed the sun was stationary. The claim entails Newton being aware of the sun's theoretical path around the galactic center as a possibility, and that may be true. On the other hand, the idea of a galaxy, or at the very least, other galaxies, wasn't even theorized until the late 1920s by a man named Hubble. Some of you may know him as he was responsible for asserting the Andromeda Nebula was really the Andromeda Galaxy. This hypothesis implied that the other, even fainter spirals in the vast night sky were probably also galaxies even further away. Hubble published his work in 1929 and changed forever our view of the known universe. Astronomers no longer thought our galaxy was the entire universe at that point. So the point is, even if Newton considered that the sun might have been traveling around a common center of orbit in relation to the other stars, it wasn't until hundreds of years later when science postulated the existence of galaxies, or at least the existence of galaxies beyond the one which supposedly houses our sun and our world. The entire idea of a galaxy with all the nearby stars orbiting a common center is merely hypothesis and isn't supported by any physical evidence other than circumstantial. If you aren't familiar with circumstantial evidence, it is helpful to develop hypothesis, but doesn't prove anything, even in our twisted courts of law. Circumstantial evidence may support a hypothesis, but it can be interpreted any number of ways and doesn't conclusively prove the hypothesis drafted around the observations. If enough circumstantial evidence supports a theory, people will often consider that as proof. However, circumstantial evidence can be erroneously framed around a hypothesis, which is why it is indeed rejected from courts of law. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. If you go to a lake near your house and see ducks, start throwing them some bread. The ducks will slowly begin to flock to you, and pretty soon all the ducks within earshot will begin to crowd you, and hopefully you brought enough bread. What can we logically prove here? Well, an erroneous line of thought would involve the circumstantial evidence of this situation and could go as follows. All of the birds near this lake are homing in on my bread. This means ducks can talk to one another, and the ducks must have a word for bread. Furthermore, all of the birds in this lake are ducks that speak the same language, and all of the ducks in the world have a common word for bread. If you can see that the flaw using circumstantial anecdotal evidence to support this theory would work in theory, but it'll also get you in trouble in terms of if you pass that off as factual. Your hypothesis certainly fits the circumstantial evidence, and that's what hypotheses are intended to do. But the chain of logic is incomplete in that example, and a totally preposterous theory is now supported by circumstantial evidence. To take this a step further in real life terms, we can view lots of what appear to be spheres flying around in the night sky, so therefore we must be a sphere flying around in the night sky. If you can see, the very same incomplete line of logic is used with the example of the birds having a universal word for bread. I think a more logical extrapolation of the ducks would be along the lines of, all the birds I can see at this lake are ducks, all of the ducks are homing in on my bread. The ducks probably don't have a word for bread, but they instinctively know to follow their duck buddies whenever they start eating. This is sort of a lame, basic example of how circumstantial evidence could possibly draw a false conclusion that works with the observations, but we simply can't use circumstantial evidence to prove anything conclusively, and just because circumstantial evidence is in line with any theory doesn't necessarily make the theory correct. If you were to say all the birds in the world are ducks because when I throw bread into the water, nothing but ducks surround me and compete for the bread, that would be similar incomplete logic, since we know there are lots of other types of birds in the world other than ducks. The pinnacle of incomplete logic would be the observer assuming that he himself was also a duck once he ate a piece of the bread. This is sort of what we have with the illogical conclusion that since we see spheres flying around the night sky, then we must also live on a sphere flying around the night sky. A minute ago, I mentioned a man named Hubble who had a telescope named after him, which beamed back pictures of so-called infinite space filled with so-called galaxies, which can only be seen by NASA from their space telescopes. All the while, the said telescope was zipping around the world at over 4.5 miles per second, or just under 17,000 miles per hour. So, in my previous video called Disproving Gravity in 15 minutes or less, I'll put a card here, and by the way, if you go to if you put your cursor on the video and go up to the top right corner of the screen, there's a little white circle with the letter I inside. If you click on that, it'll show you the cards. Anyway, I mentioned Newton believed that the sun was stationary, and I'll make a caveat or maybe a correction to that here and now and rephrase the comment about Newton. Newton possibly believed that the sun was stationary, but he also may have theorized something similar to a galaxy, with the sun racing around a common center of orbit with the other stars in the galaxy. But even in that case, even if Newton thought that we lived in a galaxy, he would have certainly believed that the galaxy was the entire universe, since the idea of galaxies or galaxies beyond our little home here wasn't even postulated until the late 1920s by Hubble. And so the center of orbit of the so-called galaxy would have been the center of the universe according to Newton, which would have necessarily been stationary. So I should point out that regardless of Newton's postulations, whether he thought the sun was stationary or he thought the center of the so-called galaxy was the center of the universe, in either case, he was 100% or maybe even 1,000% incorrect, because the world is demonstrably a stationary plane for one, but even if you subscribe to the conventional heliocentric model, you'll assert that the center of our galaxy is by no means the center of the universe. So, furthermore, the fundamental problems with orbital mechanics is outlined in my playlist called Disproving Orbital Motion. I'll put another card up there for a link to that playlist. But that would be apparent, or the problems with orbital mechanics would be apparent, even if the sun was stationary, and such fundamental impossibilities involved with orbital mechanics are compounded by every increasingly distant and high velocity center of rotational motion postulated in the heliocentric model. For every layer that you add, or every layer of rotational motion that you add, the more and more absurd it gets. For example, if the sun was stationary, then the Earth orbiting the sun would make some degree of sense. However, when you add the moon into the mix, you simply cannot have a slower, smaller body, such as the moon, orbiting a larger, faster body, which is orbiting around a parabolic curve around the sun. Since at some point during the so-called orbit of the satellite body, being the moon, it would eventually need to beat out the host around the outside of the theoretical track, after traveling in the opposite direction as the host body and the entire system itself, rendering orbital motion a theoretical impossibility, regardless of how hard you wish it to be true. Furthermore, when you add larger, faster centers of rotation into the mix, you get even bigger problems. So if you take the stationary sun system just described and then add the 500,000 miles per hour orbit of the sun around the so-called galactic center, the problem I'm pointing to is indeed compounded. Then, finally, according to the conventional paradigm, this so-called galaxy is flying off into space as a result of the so-called Big Bang, which creates even further problems for the teeny tiny orbiting moon and Earth. Again, the smaller satellite body in an orbital relationship could never possibly accelerate to many times the speed and velocity of its host, and ultimately the speed of the center of the galaxy, especially after traveling at high velocities in a direction contrary to the ultimate frame of reference, at times around the outside of the theoretical track, no less. I've put some cards in the info button anyway towards the top right screen with quick links to the video and the playlist just mentioned. At any rate, the point to all this was to prove that Newton didn't have it all figured out. Not even close. Newton had zero understanding of electromagnetism, and he also thought the sun was stationary, or if he postulated such a thing as a galaxy, he would have believed our galaxy was the center of the universe. The main point here is regardless of what system Newton ultimately subscribed to, he was indeed wrong because the world is easily proven as flat and stationary, but he was wrong even according to mainstream modern physics. So the two main points I'll cover in this video are gravity and the Coriolis effect. Gravity, I have taken the time to disprove gravity in 15 minutes or less, but I wanted to unpack that a little bit more and consider some things in a little bit more detail since a lot of people apparently still don't get it. The main two reasons why gravity doesn't work are simply listed as follows. 1. Objects near the equator will experience increased weight with increased mass. 2. Objects near the equator will weigh just slightly more when they travel to the North Pole. People who parrot physicists will assert that these 2 points are wrong or erroneous or the conclusions are off base, but I can assure you that these 2 points are legitimate to conclusively prove that gravity is a complete fallacy. So the first one, objects near the equator will experience increased weight with increased mass. So we all understand that a more massive object will always weigh more here on the ground in reality. So for control, let's first consider this fact for an observer at the equator. According to globe Earth physics, an observer at the equator will be spinning around the center of the axis of the world, allegedly located near the north and south poles, at 1,037.5 miles per hour at the equator on the face of the Earth. Now, let's not rush past this number because it's extremely significant. Physicists will argue this speed isn't that fast in relation to the massive, supposedly spinning Earth. That may be true, but what about in relation to you, the observer? Is 1,037.5 miles per hour fast in human terms? Well, indeed, it most certainly is. That's over 17 miles per minute. If you've ever flown on a commercial airline, the average airline flight only goes about 500 miles per hour. So the Earth supposedly spins double that speed and then some near the equator on the face of the Earth. We can all relate to the speed of sound. If you've ever yelled to a friend from field goal to field goal on a football field, you'll notice that the sound takes just an instant to reach your ear from that distance. So if you raise your hand when you shout, the person on the other end of the football field will see you raise your hand just an instant before they hear your voice. So sound travels at around 767 miles per hour, which is only about 3/4 of the speed as the supposed spin of the Earth. We won't even get into orbital speeds in this video, which actually dwarf the supposed speed of rotational motion, but just considering the spin of the Earth alone near the equator is supposedly faster than the speed of sound by a good bit, that's pretty daunting to consider. So even if 1,037.5 miles per hour isn't very fast in terms of the Earth itself as a whole, theoretically of course, that velocity is simply mind-boggling in human terms, and we've only just created vehicles which can break that speed or break the sound barrier within the last several decades. Now, keeping in mind the fixed frame of reference near the equator is supposedly faster than sound, for crying out loud, let's now consider the centrifugal forces or centrifugal forces involved with a body as massive as the Earth with a axis of rotation of nearly 4,000 miles spinning near the equator at a rate which exceeds the speed of sound. Now, a couple ways to demonstrate centrifugal force generated by rotational motion are as follows. Take a weight on the string and spin it, or the gravitron at the fair. So the first one, let's take a length of string and attach a weight to one end. If you grasp the other end of the string and begin to spin the weight around your fingers, you'll feel the outward pull of the weight increase as you increase the speed. So the faster you spin the string, the more outward or centrifugal forces are generated by that weight. Furthermore, if you increase the mass of the object on the end of the string, a higher amount of centrifugal force would be generated than a smaller object rotated at that same speed on the same string. There's a direct relationship between speed or acceleration, speed of rotation, and the mass of the object attached. Another big factor in the equation is the radius of curvature. In this example with the string, the radius of curvature would be the exact length of the string. As the radius is increased, so is the speed of the object towards the edge of the curve. So, in other words, even if you have a low rotations per minute or low RPMs, as the radius of curvature is increased, so too is the speed of rotation towards the edge of the curve. The second demonstration of centrifugal force is the gravitron at the fair. If you've ever been to the fair, then surely you've taken a ride on the gravitron. It's a pretty simple ride. It's a perfect circle with an engineer sitting directly in the center, parallel with the axis and on top of the axis. It's perfectly circular with the outer edges of the ride set at an angle with sliding cushions for the ride goers to rest their backs. As the ride begins to spin, the ride goers are first compelled to stick to the outside edge of the wall. As it spins even faster, the sliding cushions will pop up towards the ceiling, absorbing some of the centrifugal forces and lessening the tension on the ride goers. Now, the first observation to consider about the gravitron is that it's indeed the inverse of the spinning Earth model. So the people riding the gravitron are safe to walk around on the inside walls of the ride due to the centrifugal force pushing them outward as a result of the spinning, and the walls of the ride are pushing back in towards their feet with the exact equal and opposite amount of force as the outward centrifugal force. If we want to transfer this spinning ride to the globe Earth model, the man walking around on the walls of the ride would need to climb out over the top, over the outside edge, and then hang on for dear life, gripping to something on the outer edge of the machine. Now, if you can imagine this, the man would never be able to walk around on the outside edges of the ride without an equal and opposite force pushing down towards the inside axis. This is because the centrifugal forces compelling any object attached to the walls away from the center of curvature. In order for him to walk around on the outside edge of the ride, he would need something similar to gravity, which would necessarily be equal and opposite to the force as the centrifugal force generated by the ride pushing out. So you'd have to have at least an equal and opposite force. In the case of the ride, it's the steel cage, which is the outside edge of the ride. Now, you must have a perfect balance to negate the outward thrust, otherwise you wouldn't be able to walk around on the outside walls of the ride without being secured by chains. In the conventional model, the chains are invisible, undetectable gravity. Now, since we've got a basic understanding of centrifugal force and exactly what gravity needs to accomplish, we can begin to dissect the conventional model and see if it aligns with reality or not. One thing we can clearly see in the gravitron example is the gentleman at the center of the ride, we'll call him the engineer. We can clearly see that the engineer is in no way compelled to stick to the walls of the ride. You'll notice that he is indeed sitting directly on top of the axis and is spinning with the exact same number of rotations per minute as the people on the outside wall of the ride. Why is it that they are compelled to stick to the walls, yet he is not stuck to the ground and pushed down towards the ground? They're spinning at the same rotations per minute. The reason is he's sitting directly above the axis and parallel to the axis. Now, the further you travel away from the center of curvature, the amount of outward thrust or centrifugal force would be increased. The ride goer walking around on the outer edge of the ride is indeed perpendicular to the axis, and the amount of centrifugal forces generated by this spinning body are sufficient to defy gravity, and it allows him to walk around on the outer edge of the walls, but only because the walls are pushing in on his feet with an equal and opposite force as the outward thrust generated by the spin. If you can picture him crawling atop the outside edge of the ride and clinging on to the outer edge of the ride and hanging on for dear life, what amount of force would be necessary to allow him to safely walk around on the outside edge of the ride with no metal structure in place to prevent him from flying off into the cotton candy vendor at 60 miles an hour? This is a theoretical journey into the nonsensical. However, we're dissecting the model of the conventional spinning Earth. To answer the question, the equal and opposite force generated by the spinning object would be needed to allow him to walk around on the outside edge, and this is exactly what gravity is supposed to negate. Gravity would necessarily equate to at least the amount of force generated by the Earth spinning over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator. Now, we've already demonstrated that rotations per minute has nothing to do with centrifugal force if the radius of curvature is a major variable. The rotation of curvature on the equator is nearly 4,000 miles, meaning that even though the world is supposedly spinning once per 24 hours, the fact that the radius of curvature is so large, in human terms, the speeds generated by a body the size of the Earth spinning once per 24 hours are sufficient to generate a great deal of centrifugal force. Furthermore, remember the engineer? If you consider the engineer represents the North Pole in the conventional model, the North Pole would indeed be on top of the axis and parallel with the axis. If you were standing on the theoretical North Pole on the non-existing spherical Earth, which is only spinning in theory, you would be spinning exactly half the speed as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock. That's twice as slowly as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock, and you would be standing parallel with the axis. Now ask yourself, how much centrifugal force would you hypothesize is generated by that sort of, quote, rotational motion? Do you think it would be more than, the same as, or less than the centrifugal forces generated at the theoretical equator, where you're standing perpendicular to the axis and spinning over 1,000 miles per hour towards the east? If you said less would be generated, you would be absolutely correct. In fact, there should be an option D, because the answer would basically be zero centrifugal forces would be generated at the North Pole, which is exactly the problem I'm ultimately pointing to with gravity. In theory, if we lived on a ball spinning over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, yet spinning only half the speed as the hour hand on a 12-hour clock at the North Pole, the disparity between the theoretical centrifugal force generated at the equator would be nearly infinite, meaning the outward thrust generated at the equator by the theoretically rotating Earth would be abundant, yet the centrifugal force generated at the North Pole would be essentially zero. So what is the problem I have? Well, a person weighs in at essentially the same amount in reality. If you travel to the equator and weigh yourself, you'll weigh just slightly less than you would if you traveled to the North Pole and weighed yourself. The difference is so negligible you can practically say that you would weigh the same at both points. The major flaw and ultimately proof that the world isn't a spinning globe is because gravity is supposedly caused by the mass of Earth warping space-time, and the vacuum of space is supposedly pushing down towards the center of the Earth evenly at all points of this theoretical spinning Earth. If you can imagine the inward thrust allowing this guy to walk around on the outer walls being exerted upon the engineer in the center, would you hypothesize that he would weigh the same, less, or more than he did without the equal and opposite force to the centrifugal pushing down upon his body? Again, the ridegoer is compelled to the outside edge with enough force to allow him to disobey gravity and walk around on the inside edge of the outer wall. If you applied the equal and opposite force to the engineer in the center, he would weigh a lot more because there is not the same outward thrust generated at the 0-degree latitude or at the dead center or at the North Pole, standing parallel to and on top of the axis. The North Pole is similarly situated upon the supposed axis of rotation, while the observer at the equator is 4,000 miles from the axis, standing perpendicular to the axis, theoretically spinning over 1,000 miles per hour eastward. Any person who argues with this point is a mindless repeater who simply doesn't get it. You see, basic logic completely demolishes the idea of a spinning sphere Earth, with gravity allowing people to safely walk along the outside edge of a giant spinning sphere floating around in space, spinning faster than the speed of sound near the equator, yet spinning half the speed as the hour hand on a clock at the poles, with the weight on a scale essentially remaining consistent from point to point. There's a slight variance in weight from the North Pole to the equator. However, it's entirely consistent with the well-known, well-documented drop in barometric pressure as you travel from north to south, with the pressure being highest in the north, or center of the actual flat Earth map, and the barometric pressure dropping markedly lower and lower as you travel south towards and beyond the equator. Barometric pressure has a direct effect on your weight on a scale. With the pressure being highest towards the center, the person at the center will weigh slightly more than the person at the so-called equator. The simple fact is, if the world was indeed a sphere spinning at the given velocity, allegedly faster than the speed of sound at the equator, the amount of so-called gravity needed to negate the outward thrust of such a massive spinning spherical body would be so tremendously overwhelming if standing at the North Pole. Remember, when standing at the equator, you would be perpendicular to the axis, with gravity providing a steel cage of sorts, necessarily exerting the equal and opposite force to oppose the outward thrust generated by the hypothetical spinning Earth. If you were to apply that same amount of force down upon the head of the man standing at the North Pole, since he is discernibly not spinning whatsoever, again, half the speed is the hour hand on a 12-hour clock to be exact, he would be rendered as a pancake. This has nothing to do with gravity somehow being more prevalent at the North Pole, but it has to do with the fact that he would be standing atop of the axis and not spinning while standing at the North Pole, with the same amount of gravity needed to keep him stuck to the equator, standing parallel with the axis, zipping around a curve with a radius of nearly 4,000 miles, faster than the speed of sound. Furthermore, remember the first experiment mentioned in this video involving a weight and a string? If you remember, if you increase the mass of the weight, you'll also increase the amount of centrifugal or outward force. This means at the equator, if the world was indeed a spinning sphere, as mass is increased, you should see a marked increase in outward thrust. This means objects should get lighter and lighter on a scale as mass is increased, at least at the equator. You realize this is because of the necessary centrifugal force generated by an object as massive as the Earth spinning once per 24 hours. Keeping in mind, centrifugal force is determined by several variables, including the radius of curvature and ultimately the velocity of objects connected to the outer edge of the curve. So I mentioned this before, but a little experiment you can do is, to prove this point, is take two 1-pound objects, one in each hand. Stretch your arms out to your sides. If you begin to spin, you'll feel the outward thrust of the weights sort of tugging out on your arms and tugging out on your shoulder blades. Now, if you were to increase those two objects, instead of two 1-pound objects, you had two 10-pound weights and spun around at the same speed, the outward thrust generated by those two objects would be greater. And if you transfer that to the globe Earth model, then more and more massive objects should get lighter and lighter on a scale, at least at the equator. Now, such fundamental flaws in the theory of gravity are abundantly clear to the logical, unbiased, rational thinker. Pseudoscientists will take measurements of a person's weight at the equator, or say a ton of coffee at the equator, and the ton of coffee still weighs about a ton at the North Pole. There is a slight variance in weight between a ton of coffee at the equator and a ton of coffee at the North Pole, but what they'll do is they'll then make the fundamentally flawed assumption that the Earth is a spinning sphere and cram the observation of weight at the two stated locations as proof of the spinning sphere. This is the opposite of critical thinking and the opposite of science. A ton of coffee at the equator should weigh a lot more at the North Pole, simply because there is no outward thrust generated by the spinning Earth at the North Pole. And the amount of gravity at the North Pole would be the same as it was at the equator without the outward thrust of a spinning object going 1,000 miles an hour around a center of curvature with a radius of 4,000 miles. We cannot cram all observations to fit the spinning sphere Earth model, and we must take all observations at face value. The fact that a ton of coffee at the equator is still essentially a ton of coffee at the North Pole conclusively proves that the world is not a spinning sphere, and the theory of gravity is a logically repulsive fallacy. Speaking of logically repulsive fallacies, let's unpack the second topic of the video, the Coriolis effect.
This is Dr. Keith Miller from Kansas State University, and what I'm going to do with this demonstration is illustrate a very important concept, very important factor that affects both global atmospheric circulation and weather patterns, and that's the Coriolis effect. Coriolis effect is a consequence of the differential rotation of the Earth's equator versus the poles. And because the Earth is spinning, and if you imagine someone standing at the equator, in a 24-hour period, they travel entirely around the circumference of the Earth, which means they're moving at a velocity of something like 1,000 miles per hour from someone standing outside of the Earth. While as a person who's at the poles is essentially stationary. And this differential motion of the Earth's surface relative to latitude, the position on the globe, generates the effect called the Coriolis effect. So to illustrate this, we're going to use a playground merry-go-round to act as an illustration of the Coriolis effect and the spinning Earth. Okay, we're taking this playground merry-go-round as a illustration of the rotating Earth. So instead of a sphere, we have a flat disk. But notice that the person in the middle, essentially at the poles, is moving very little. They're just rotating around in place. Whereas the person on the outside is moving at a much higher rate, a much higher velocity than the person in the center. And this is the whole basis of the Coriolis effect, where you have two people moving at different rates and different velocities at different places on a sphere, or in this case on a disk. So we can use this merry-go-round as an example of the spinning Earth. The Coriolis effect also works from any two positions on a rotating disk or a rotating globe, even across the axis of rotation. So as in this image with two people on opposite sides of the axis of rotation, the Coriolis effect is still operable because the two individuals are moving in different directions on the opposite sides of the disk. To begin with, we have the ball being thrown back and forth on a stationary disk. Now we're rotating the disk counterclockwise. This would be the same direction of rotation as in the Earth's northern hemisphere. Notice that the ball is always moving to the right of the intended recipient of the ball. So a deflection in a Coriolis effect is always to the right. If we now have the rotation going clockwise, that is the direction of the rotation of the southern hemisphere viewed at the South Pole, the deflection will be to the left, in the opposite direction to that of the northern hemisphere.
The Coriolis effect is a fundamentally logical observation involving a rotating body as a fixed frame of reference. The easiest way to explain the Coriolis effect is by considering a merry-go-round. Anyone with access to a public park with a merry-go-round can demonstrate the Coriolis effect. If you're on a merry-go-round with an assistant directly opposite one another facing in towards the center of the ride, if you throw a ball directly to your assistant while the merry-go-round is spinning counterclockwise, the ball will travel in a straight line from your hands to the point where your assistant was when you threw it. However, it will appear as if the ball veers off to the right from your frame of reference, although it has actually gone in a straight line from the point where you let it go. Since you continue spinning counterclockwise, yet the ball is immediately stripped of its rotational frame of reference upon being compelled in the direction of your assistant, from your fixed rotational frame of reference, the ball will appear to veer off to the right. The Coriolis effect is a natural law of rotating bodies as a fixed frame of reference, which clearly proves that any object fixed to a rotational frame of reference will absolutely not maintain its rotational frame of reference if compelled in any direction contrary to the fixed center of curvature. The Coriolis effect conclusively demonstrates how objects, or liquids, or gases, should behave on the world, if it was actually a spinning sphere. Pseudoscience, aka scientism, aka heliocentrism, or simply globism, loves to pick and choose arguments when the argument is convenient to their model, yet will flatly refuse to acknowledge the very same argument when it conclusively shows the world to be totally stationary. This is one of the most comical aspects of the globe Earth lie. So we'll go on a journey of logically repulsive globism to witness the comical irony of the Coriolis effect. When applied to the globe Earth, it actually disproves it. So the globeheads, aka round earthers, aka Riris, no, I'm sorry, REs, not Riris. The round earthers will tell you the Coriolis effect proves the world as a spinning sphere. The observations which lead to this conclusion are as follows. We see cyclones in the northern hemisphere traveling in the opposite rotational direction as cyclones in the southern hemisphere, therefore we live on a spinning globe. The logic of this position is as ridiculous and incomplete as the logic involved with the stance, when I release my pen it falls to the ground, therefore we live on a spinning globe. You simply cannot take a single observation such as the direction of rotational cyclones or objects falling to the ground and cram those observations into somehow being proof of a spinning globe. First of all, the opposing rotation of cyclones is not fixed to the equator, but instead that terminating line or dividing line which divides the direction of rotation actually follows the sun in its seasonal pass from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a year. Riris will assert this dividing line is actually fixed to the equator, but indeed it is not. Furthermore, the Coriolis effect shows that objects fixed to a rotational frame of reference simply do not adhere to that frame of reference when compelled in any direction contrary to the circular path around the center of rotation, and will absolutely not remain fixed to such a frame of reference unless held fastly secured to the rotational frame of reference. Again, if you spin a weight around a string and let go of the string, the weight will absolutely not continue twirling around your fingers, fixed to the rotational frame of reference as it did when it was fixed to the string. Similarly, on the merry-go-round, if you toss a ball over to your assistant across from you, the ball will not remain fixed to the rotational frame of reference as it did when firmly grasped by your hands. Similarly, if you were to launch an airplane from such a merry-go-round, the jet engines on the plane would be far more adequate of independent propulsion than a simple flick of the wrists, and the airplane would absolutely never remain fixed to the rotational frame of reference of the allegedly spinning face of the Earth, considering the plane is no longer fixed to the ground, and a westbound plane is indeed traveling in the opposite direction as the supposed spin of the Earth. The reason why the Coriolis effect proves that the world is completely stationary is because a 2,500-mile flight from New York to LA is identical in duration oftentimes with its return flight from LA to New York. I'm very sorry to say this, but the Riris cannot have their cake and eat it too. You cannot point to the Coriolis effect to prove the globe in terms of cyclones, yet ignore the Coriolis effect when talking about jet airplanes with multiple engines attached propelling the plane in a direction contrary to the rotational motion of the face of the Earth, especially when the plane is not connected to the ground anymore. Flight distances are measured in miles on the ground. Since the ground and the destinations are indeed theoretically attached to the rotational frame of reference, yet the westbound airplane is not, the airplane's maximum speed would be added to the rotational velocity of the destination. In this case, the westbound flight from New York would have a much higher relative speed to the destination than the return flight traveling in the same direction as the spin. On the other hand, the return flight from LA would also not be connected to the Earth, and therefore would need to race against the destination, slipping out of the rotational frame of reference for every second that it wastes energy ascending into the air. The simple fact is, given the admitted law demonstrated by the ball on the merry-go-round being the Coriolis effect, any object fixed to a rotational frame of reference will immediately slip out of that frame of reference when it's no longer fixed to the rotating body and is compelled in a direction contrary to that of the center of rotation. The actual Coriolis effect proves the world as stationary, and the observations of cyclones is very much in line with the flat Earth model, as the dividing line between the directions of rotations of the cyclonic forces in the atmosphere trails along with the path of the sun and is not fixed to the equator. Just as the pen falling to the ground is very much in line with the flat Earth model and is contrary to logic in the spinning Earth model, so too the Coriolis effect is very much in line with the flat Earth model and absolutely contradicts the spinning sphere Earth model. Again, the two airplanes would not be connected to the rotational frame of reference, and therefore, since the two flights often have identical duration, we can safely assert that the world is fixed and not rotating at any speed whatsoever. When you couple this fact with other known facts such as E.N.A.G's failure, which demonstrate that when the light from stars travels through a telescope filled with water, which water supposedly slows down the speed of light, E.N.A.G's failure was intended to show that the Earth was spinning and the stars overhead were indeed stationary, but what it actually showed was the opposite of that, meaning the light from the stars, when slowed through the water in the telescope, the light didn't hit the edge of the walls of the telescope, and E.N.A.G's failure demonstrates the opposite, that the world is not spinning, rather the ether overhead and the stars themselves are spinning.
If a telescope is pointing at a star and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further. In 1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical. If it had been the telescope that was moving, Airy expected a figure of 30 seconds of arc. In fact, he only managed to read 0.8 seconds of arc difference. Bradley first discovered stellar aberration, and it is interesting that in his report, Airy mentions that it was now about 100 seconds of arc, and that it was still slowly diminishing. This indicates that the speed of light was still decreasing in measurable amounts when Airy performed his experiment in 1871. The result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth. What is interesting in his very brief report of only 4 pages is that not once did he refer to the astonishing results that the experiment proved, that the Earth was stationary.
Hopefully this video will answer more questions than it raises. In summary, basic fundamental laws of physics prove the world couldn't possibly be a spinning sphere of any sort. All of the arguments intended to prove the world as a spinning sphere are actually contrary to the fundamental laws involving rotating bodies. The Coriolis Effect and Gravity are but 2 examples of how science, specifically theoretical physics, has been systematically divorced from the scientific method and is instead used as a social, cultural tool to distort our view of reality. In other videos, I've shown the world to be obviously flat and stationary. If the world is demonstrably a stationary plane, then it by definition couldn't possibly be a spinning globe. This means NASA and science fiction have been, well, synonymous, because NASA and other so-called spacefaring nation agencies have been sending us pictures and stories of infinite space in a spinning sphere Earth. When you realize that all space-faring nations happen to be proud members of the Antarctic Treaty, their motives become clear. There's something beyond the so-called southernmost region of the world that they don't want us discovering. I find it sort of hard to believe that there's any sort of physical boundary between the outer semiplane and infinity. Why would the world powers go to such great lengths to create the illusion of a spinning sphere with no escape if we indeed lived on an enclosed system with no escape? The Antarctic Treaty was signed into law in the 1950s and remains uncontested to this day through all the energy crises and oil crises in the last 50 years. There has to be a good reason why the governments of the world would keep all people and corporations out of Antarctica as much as possible, keep Antarctica out of the public mind as much as possible, and even go to the length of faking space and faking the globe Earth to cover it up. They've gotten so deep into this lie that there's absolutely no way to turn back from it and admit the dishonesty. So, most of the world is completely misinformed anyways and will violently lash out at any person simply asking questions about the spinning sphere Earth and how it doesn't make any sense, or the heliocentric model or the Big Bang and how they don't make any sense in general. Scientists feels comfortable with the Big Bang model and evolution, and so they will ignore contrary evidence and ridicule dissent. Dissent, inquiry, and skepticism are all fundamental motives for science. The scientific method and the zetetic process were implemented by rational thinkers to solve problems and understand reality properly. Theoretical physics has hijacked the minds of most scientists, which prevents them from understanding the truth. And theoretical physics is so far removed from the scientific method because the tenets for such theories as the Big Bang or light years are not demonstrable, nor are they falsifiable, rendering the entire field as a whole as viable as science fiction and ultimately pseudoscience. I've set up a fan funding option in response to the request of my subscribers. You obviously don't have to contribute, although the option is there if you'd like to. I do want to take just a second to extend a warm thank you to those of you who have already contributed to my fan funding page. I wanted to let you all know that I really appreciate your support. However, the contributions come in anonymously via fan funding, so I have no way to thank you personally. Just know that it is very much appreciated, and I can happily say that with your help, I'm able to continue making such videos. So, thank you all for your support. Thank you for watching. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.